Turin, Italy, the night of May 28th, 1898. A lawyer named Secondo Pia is standing alone in a dark room, watching a glass photographic plate float in a tray of chemicals. He is not a scientist. He is an amateur photographer who has just been given permission to do something no one has ever done before: to point a camera at the cloth kept in the cathedral down the road. And then he stops breathing, because a face is rising out of the glass, and it is looking back at him. For more than 500 years, pilgrims had knelt in front of that cloth. Kings had carried it across the Alps. Fire had nearly destroyed it twice. And in all that time, not one human being had ever seen what Secondo Pia was seeing that night. Because the image on the Shroud of Turin is a negative. The cloth itself is the photograph. Pia's camera had simply reversed it back. Since that night, this single piece of linen has become the most heavily tested object in the history of archaeology. Physicists, chemists, forensic pathologists, textile experts, geneticists, and after nearly 50 years of laboratory work, the world's scientists still cannot agree on what they are looking at. So has modern science finally proven the shroud real? Or has it quietly proven the opposite, and we simply refuse to hear the answer? Today we are going to walk through every piece of evidence that actually exists. The wounds no medieval artist could have known about. The carbon test that should have ended this argument forever. The chemist who set out to prove the believers wrong and ended up proving them right. And the DNA results published this year, in 2026, that made the mystery deeper instead of solving it. Before any of that, though, there is something you need to know. And most people get it wrong. Many people assume that the Catholic Church teaches that the Shroud of Turin is the burial cloth of Jesus. It does not. It never has. There is no dogma here, no article of faith, nothing you are required to believe. In 1998, standing in front of the cloth in Turin, St. John Paul II said something remarkable for a pope to say. He said the Church has no specific competence to pronounce on questions like this, and he handed the work of investigation over to scientists. He called the shroud a mirror of the gospel, an image that reflects the passion back at us. Not a proof, a mirror. So what is it? Physically, it is a strip of linen roughly 4.4 meters long and just over a meter wide. Think of a dining table laid end to end. The weave is a 3-to-1 herringbone twill, the kind of pattern you would find on an expensive fabric rather than a cheap one. And it carries two faint, straw-colored images of a naked man. One from the front, one from the back, laid head to head as though the cloth had been placed under a body and then folded over the top of it. Here is where people get their second impression wrong. The shroud is not a portrait. Nobody is posing. There is no framing. No composition, no artistic arrangement of the kind you find in every medieval devotional painting. What is on that cloth looks less like a picture of a man and more like a stain left behind by one. The cloth has survived a violent history. In 1532, a fire in the chapel at Chambéry melted the silver of the reliquary and burned holes straight through the folded linen, leaving a symmetrical row of scorch marks that nuns patched by hand 2 years later. In 1997, the cathedral in Turin caught fire again, and a firefighter named Mario Trematore smashed through layers of bulletproof glass with a sledgehammer to drag it out. It has been examined, folded, boiled in oil, sewn, photographed, and prayed over for centuries. Which raises the question that this entire story turns on. If this is a forgery, who made it, and how? Because when forensic scientists began reading the body on that cloth, they did not find the Jesus of medieval European art. They found something far stranger. Start with the hands. In virtually every crucifix carved or painted in Europe before the year 1500, the nails go through the palms. That is how the tradition drew it. On the shroud, the nail wound is not in the palm, it is in the wrist. That detail matters more than it sounds. A hand nailed through the palm cannot hold the weight of an adult body. The flesh tears between the bones. Roman executioners knew this. Modern anatomists confirmed it only in the 20th century. And the wrist entry point on the shroud corresponds to a natural gap in the bones that a nail can pass through cleanly. There is something else on the image. The thumbs of both hands are not visible. A nail driven through that part of the wrist damages the median nerve, and the thumb contracts inward against the palm. An artist in the year 1300 would have had to invent an anatomical detail that contradicted every image he had ever seen, for a reason he could not possibly have known. Now look at the back. The image is covered in small marks, somewhere between 90 and 120 of them, scattered across the shoulders, the back, the buttocks, and the legs. Each one is shaped like a tiny dumbbell, two round impressions joined by a short line. That is the signature of a Roman flagrum, a whip with leather thongs tipped with small lead weights. The marks fan out from two different angles, as though two men were working, one on each side. Then there is the head. Not a neat circle of thorns resting on the brow, the way Renaissance painters loved to draw it, but puncture wounds scattered across the entire scalp, including the back of the skull. Whatever was pressed onto this man's head was not a wreath, it was a cap. There is a wound in the right side, between the ribs, roughly 4 centimeters across, the width of a Roman lance head. And around that wound, the stain separates. There is blood, and there is a lighter, watery fluid that has spread further out along the fibers. A pathologist would recognize that instantly as blood serum separating after death, which happens when a body has been still long enough for the components to divide. The Gospel of John, chapter 19, verse 34, describes a soldier piercing the side of Jesus with a lance, and says that blood and water flowed out. For centuries, readers treated that line as symbolic. On this cloth, it appears to be a description, and one more thing is missing from the image, which is stranger than anything present in it. The legs are not broken. Crucifixion victims were normally finished off by having their leg bones shattered, so they could no longer push upward to breathe. John's Gospel says the soldiers did not do this to Jesus because he was already dead. The man on the shroud has intact legs and a chest frozen in the fully expanded position of someone who died struggling for air. Now imagine you are a forger in medieval France. You have no anatomy textbooks. You have never seen a crucifixion. You have never heard of blood serum. And somehow you decide to paint a Jesus that contradicts the artistic tradition of your entire civilization in a dozen separate details. Every single one of which will only be verified as correct 600 years after your death. It doesn't stop there. Because in 1976, a piece of American laboratory equipment turned the mystery into something much harder to explain away. Two scientists, John Jackson and Eric Jumper, borrowed a machine called a VP8 image analyzer. It had been built for reading photographs sent back from space, and it worked on a simple principle. It converted the brightness of each point in an image into height. Bright meant close, dark meant far. Feed it a photograph of a crater on Mars, and it would build you a relief map of that crater. Feed it a normal photograph of a human face, and you get a mess, a distorted smear. Because the brightness in a photograph depends on where the lamps were standing, not on the shape of the person. They fed it a photograph of the shroud, and a 3-dimensional human form stood up out of the screen. Nose, cheekbones, the ridge of the brow, the crossed hands, all of it correctly proportioned. That result told them something very specific about how the image was made. The darkness of the shroud's image is not describing light and shadow. It is describing distance, how far each point on the cloth was from the surface of the body beneath it, where the linen touched the skin. The image is strongest where it draped away. The image fades. At first glance, this seems like a small technical curiosity. In reality, it is one of the hardest facts in the entire case. Painters do not encode distance. They encode light. No known artistic technique before the modern era produces an image whose intensity maps to the gap between cloth and flesh. And no one has yet explained why a forger would even want to. By the late 1970s, that was where the situation stood. A cloth with a photographic negative on it, containing accurate three-dimensional information, showing a crucified man whose wounds matched Roman practice better than they matched Christian art. Which is exactly why, in October of 1978, a team of American scientists was allowed to do something no one had ever been permitted to do. They were given the Shroud of Turin for 5 straight days, around the clock, and they brought 8 tons of equipment with them. They called themselves STURP, the Shroud of Turin Research Project. Around 30 scientists, most of them Americans, many of them drawn from Los Alamos and Sandia National Laboratories, the places where the United States builds and tests nuclear weapons. These were not theologians. Several of them were agnostics. At least one went to Turin openly expecting to identify the pigment and go home. For 120 consecutive hours in October 1978, they had the cloth to themselves. They photographed it in ultraviolet and infrared. They ran X-ray fluorescence across its surface. They lifted samples of the surface fibers using strips of adhesive tape, a technique borrowed from crime scene work. They examined the linen under microscopes at magnifications that could resolve a single fiber. They were looking for paint. They did not find any. There is no pigment layer on the Shroud of Turin. No cinnabar, no ochre, no lead white. No organic dye pooled in the weave. There are no brushstrokes and no directionality of any kind. Every artistic technique known to the medieval world leaves traces of the hand that made it. A stroke that runs one way rather than another. Under magnification, the shroud's image has no such trace. It simply appears, fiber by fiber, with no pattern of application at all. What they found instead was even harder to accept. The image is not soaked into the cloth. It sits on the outermost surface of the outermost fibers, to a depth measured at roughly 200 nanometers. To give you a sense of that number, a human hair is about 80,000 nanometers thick. The image occupies a layer 400 times thinner than a single hair. Turn the cloth over, and on most of the image there is nothing on the other side. Whatever colored those fibers did not sink in. It touched the top and stopped. And the coloring itself is not a substance added to the linen. It appears to be the linen, a chemical alteration of the cellulose, a kind of accelerated aging or dehydration. The same yellowing that would take centuries to happen naturally, concentrated into a shape. Then came the detail that unsettled the team most. They tested the blood stains, and unlike the image, the blood is real. It contains hemoglobin, and it tests positive for bilirubin, a compound produced in unusual quantities when a body is under extreme physical stress or trauma. But here is the part that matters. Where a blood stain sits on the cloth, and you look underneath it, there is no image. The fibers under the blood are blank, which means the blood was on that cloth first. The image formed afterward, around it. Consider what that requires of a forger. He must paint the blood onto an empty sheet in the exact anatomical positions of wounds that will only match a body later, and then produce his image second, perfectly registered around stains he laid down beforehand, with no pigment, no brush, and no penetration deeper than 200 nanometers. The STURP team published their conclusion in 1981, and it is worth noting how carefully they phrased it. They said the image is not the product of an artist. They said it is a real human form of a scourged, crucified man. And then they said, in plain language, that they could not explain how the image was formed, and that the problem remained unsolved. Nearly 50 years later, it is still unsolved. Not for lack of trying. Researchers have proposed corona discharge, chemical vapors rising from a decomposing body, contact with a heated statue. And in 2011, a team at Italy's National Research Agency, ENEA, reported that ultraviolet excimer lasers could produce a coloring in linen with similar surface characteristics. while noting that the total power required was far beyond anything available in the ancient world, and in some respects beyond convenient reach even today. By the mid-1980s, the case for authenticity looked close to overwhelming. A photographic negative, three-dimensional data, forensically accurate wounds, real blood, applied first, no paint. And yet everything you have just heard was about to be swept off the table in a single afternoon. Because in 1988, the church did something that surprised almost everyone. It allowed the cloth to be cut. On the 21st of April that year, in the sacristy of Turin Cathedral, a strip of linen was removed from one corner of the shroud and divided among three independent laboratories: Oxford, Zurich, and the University of Arizona. Each received a sample. Each ran radiocarbon dating, the standard method for establishing the age of organic material by measuring how much of its carbon-14 has decayed. The laboratories worked separately. Not one of them knew what the others were finding. On the 13th of October 1988, the results were announced at a press conference in London. The Archbishop of Turin read them aloud. The three laboratories had converged on a single range with 95% confidence, between 1260 and 1390. Not the 1st century, the High Middle Ages. And the range did not merely miss the time of Christ, it landed almost exactly on the moment the shroud first appears in documented European history. The earliest undisputed record of this cloth is at the Collegiate Church of Lirey in France in the 1350s, in the hands of a knight named Geoffroy de Chalny. There was worse. Around 1389, the local bishop, Pierre d'Arcy, wrote a memorandum to the Pope in Avignon complaining about the cloth being displayed at Lirey. In it, he claimed that a predecessor of his had investigated the matter years earlier and had obtained a confession that the image was the work of a human artist, and that the whole thing was a fraud staged to draw money out of pilgrims. So there it was, a laboratory date and a contemporary written accusation, pointing at the same century, in the same region of France. For a great many people, that was the end of the story. Newspapers around the world ran the word fake. The scientific consensus hardened almost overnight, and it has largely stayed hardened ever since. If you look the shroud up today in most general reference works, that 1988 date is still the headline number. And this is the moment where the honest thing to do is stop and say something clearly. Radiocarbon dating is not junk science. It is one of the most reliable tools archaeology possesses. It has dated the Dead Sea Scrolls, Egyptian tombs, Viking ships. Anyone who waves it away because they dislike the answer is not reasoning, they are wishing. So the question was never whether carbon dating works. The question asked by a very small number of people who refused to walk away was much narrower and much more dangerous. Was the piece they cut representative of the rest of the cloth? The man who ended up asking it hardest was not a believer trying to rescue a relic. He was a chemist trying to shut one down. Raymond Rogers had been on the STURP team in 1978. He was a thermal analysis specialist at Los Alamos, a man with decades of published work on how materials degrade. And he had no patience for what he saw as sentimental nonsense from the pro-authenticity crowd. When people began arguing that the 1988 sample had come from a medieval repair patch woven invisibly into the corner, Rogers considered the idea absurd. He said as much publicly, and because he still had fibers left over from 1978, sealed away for a quarter of a century, he decided to prove it wrong himself. He compared the leftover threads from the main body of the cloth with material from the radiocarbon corner, and what he found reversed his position entirely. The corner threads carried a cotton content the main cloth did not have. They showed traces of a plant-based dye, of the kind a skilled weaver would use to color new thread so it blends into old linen. The two regions were chemically different materials. Then he ran the test that made his name in this argument. Linen contains lignin, and lignin contains vanillin, the same compound that gives vanilla its smell. Vanillin decays slowly and predictably over time. Rogers found vanillin in the radiocarbon corner threads. He found none in the fibers from the main body of the shroud, and he found none in linen from the Dead Sea Scrolls either. He published the work in the journal Thermochimica Acta in 2005, arguing that the sample cut in 1988 was not part of the original cloth, and that the main body of the shroud was far older than the test had suggested. He died of cancer shortly afterward. He never converted. He simply followed his own data to a conclusion he had set out to demolish. What is worth noting is that he was not the last one to look. In 2019, researchers obtained the raw measurement data from the 1988 laboratories after a legal request. Data that had never been fully published. Their statistical reanalysis reported that the individual subsamples did not agree with one another as cleanly as the announcement had implied. That there was a gradient running through the strip, older at one end than the other. That is not what you expect from a uniform piece of cloth. It is what you expect from a patch. And in 2022, a research team in Italy led by Liberato De Caro tried a completely different clock. Wide-angle X-ray scattering does not measure carbon at all. It measures structure over long periods of time. The cellulose inside a linen fiber slowly loses its crystalline order, and that decay can be read directly by firing X-rays through the fiber and studying how they scatter. It is a clock built out of geometry rather than chemistry. De Caro's team applied it to a thread from the shroud and compared the pattern against linen samples of known age, including fabric recovered from the fortress of Masada, which fell to the Romans in the year 73. Their published result placed the shroud in the same structural neighborhood as that first-century material, roughly 2,000 years old. It has to be said plainly that this is not a knockout blow, and the authors themselves did not present it as one. The method depends on assumptions about the temperature and humidity a cloth has been stored in across the centuries. And the shroud has been through fires, floods, and a great deal of travel. Change the assumed storage conditions, and the calculated age shifts with them. So where does that leave the dating question? Honestly, it leaves it contested. One test says medieval, several later tests say ancient. Each side has legitimate criticisms of the other, and no new sample has been released for independent testing since 1988. Which is why researchers went looking for a different kind of evidence altogether. Not chemistry, paperwork. If the shroud was manufactured somewhere in France in the 14th century, then no one anywhere on Earth should have known what it looked like before then. Any depiction of it that predates 1260 would be a serious problem for the carbon result. There is a book in the National Library in Budapest called the Prey Codex. It is a Hungarian manuscript, and it is securely dated to around 1192. At minimum 68 years before the earliest edge of the radiocarbon range, and roughly a century and a half before the shroud surfaces at Lirae. One of its illustrations shows the burial of Christ. The body is naked, which is unusual for the period. The arms are crossed low over the pelvis in the same awkward position seen on the shroud. And the artist has drawn the hands with 4 fingers and no thumbs. In the panel beneath, showing the empty tomb, the burial cloth is decorated with a stepped, zigzag pattern that many researchers read as an attempt to render herringbone weave. And then there are the circles. Set into that cloth is a small group of round marks arranged in an L shape. A pattern that corresponds to the poker holes burned through the shroud, holes that exist on the actual cloth and were already there before the fire of 1532. Now is this proof? No. Skeptics answer that the circles are decorative, that the missing thumbs are stylistic shorthand, that human beings are extremely good at finding the patterns they are looking for. Those are fair objections, and they have not been settled. But a manuscript painted in Hungary in the 12th century, showing a burial cloth with an L-shaped group of holes on it, is at minimum a coincidence that requires explaining. There is also a longer thread that runs east in the ancient city of Edessa. In what is now southern Turkey, a cloth bearing the face of Christ was venerated for centuries. The image of Edessa, sometimes called the Mandylion, it was moved to Constantinople in the year 944 with an imperial ceremony. and when Crusaders sacked Constantinople in 1204, it disappeared from history. A hypothesis first argued in detail by the historian Ian Wilson proposes that the mandilion and the shroud are the same cloth. Kept folded so that only the face was visible, it is a hypothesis. It is not established fact. And the documentary chain has real gaps in it. Still, if you are looking for the century when a cloth like this vanished from the East and reappeared in the West, 1204 to the 1350s is a suggestive gap. And now we come to the part of this story that is happening right now. In our own time, because the shroud has a companion, in the Cathedral of Oviedo in northern Spain. There is a second cloth. It is much smaller, about 84 by 53 centimeters. And unlike the shroud, it carries no image at all, only stains. It is called the Sudarium of Oviedo, and it is documented in Spain long before the medieval carbon window opens. Records place it in the Iberian Peninsula by around the 7th or 8th century, kept in a chest of relics that was carried inland ahead of invading armies. Open the Gospel of John, chapter 20, verses 6 and 7, and you find something most readers pass straight over, when Peter enters the empty tomb. John records two separate items, the linen cloths lying there, and the cloth that had covered the head, folded up in a place by itself. Not one burial cloth, two. Spanish researchers, working through the Centro Español de Sindonología, have spent decades comparing the Sudarium stains with the face of the shroud. They report a correspondence in the pattern of the stains, in the spacing of wounds on the back of the head, in the outline of the nose. Both cloths have been reported to carry blood of type AB. Here, caution is required, and you deserve to hear it. Other specialists argue that reliable blood typing on samples this degraded is simply not achievable, and that some of the matching claims have been overstated in television documentaries. This is contested territory, not settled fact. Which brings us to March of 2026. A team of geneticists coordinated by Gianni Barcaccia at the University of Padua and Alessandro Achilli at the University of Pavia did something no one had done before. They took the official dust and fiber samples collected during the STURP campaign back in 1978, samples that had been sitting preserved for nearly half a century, and ran full metagenomic sequencing on them. Metagenomics means you do not go hunting for one particular gene. You sequence everything. Every fragment of human, plant, animal, and microbial DNA in the sample. And then you read the whole ecosystem at once. The results were published in the journal Scientific Reports. What came back was not a verdict. It was a map. They found multiple human mitochondrial lineages, which is exactly what you would expect on an object handled by thousands of people across centuries. Among them was haplogroup H33, a rare lineage found today mainly in the Near East and notably common among the Druze, a community whose genetic ancestry overlaps with Jewish and Levantine populations. They found halophilic microorganisms, salt-loving microbes of the kind that thrive in extremely saline environments, such as the region around the Dead Sea. They found DNA from Mediterranean red coral, from cultivated plants, from domesticated animals. And they found something nobody predicted: a substantial share of the human genetic signal, by some readings close to 40%. Traces to Indian lineages. That led the researchers to raise the possibility that the yarn itself was spun in India and carried west along the ancient trade routes that ran between the subcontinent and the Mediterranean, long before the 1st century. Believers read those headlines and saw confirmation. A cloth carrying Near Eastern DNA and Dead Sea microbes, exactly where the Gospels put the burial. But read the researchers' own words, and they are careful people. They state directly that DNA cannot date the cloth and cannot establish authenticity. It can only describe where the object has been and who has touched it. And within weeks, outside geneticists were publicly questioning the methodology, warning that ancient DNA work is notoriously vulnerable to contamination, and that these particular conclusions were running ahead of the data. And here is the detail that makes this story so strange and so honest. In that very same year, another study came to the opposite conclusion. Using three-dimensional digital modeling, researchers compared the shroud image against a simulated human body and against a shallow relief sculpture. The body produced distortion. A real cloth draped over a real face wraps around the sides and generates a wider image than the one on the shroud. The shallow relief produced a much closer match. So in a single year, the most advanced genetic analysis ever performed on this cloth pointed east, toward Jerusalem. And the most advanced imaging analysis pointed at a piece of medieval sculpture. That is where we actually are. Not at a solution, at a fork. Now let me ask you something that has nothing to do with laboratories. Why do you think the Catholic Church has never settled this? The Church has had this cloth in its custody for centuries. It could have declared it authentic at any point and gathered enormous devotion around that declaration. It did the opposite. It permitted the 1988 test that came back medieval. It has consistently called the shroud an icon rather than a proof. And it has never once required a single believer to accept it. That restraint is not weakness. It is the whole logic of Christian faith working exactly as it was designed to. Think about what happens the moment a relic becomes proof. Faith stops being trust and becomes arithmetic. You would not be believing in a person any longer. You would be believing in a laboratory report. And laboratory reports get revised. If your faith stood on the shroud, then the announcement in October 1988 would have destroyed it. And the DNA paper in 2026 would have rebuilt it. And next year, some new instrument would knock it down again. Jesus said something about this to Thomas, who had touched the wounds with his own hands. Blessed are those who have not seen and yet have believed. Now think about your own life for a moment. Most of us are quietly waiting for our version of the shroud, one undeniable sign. One piece of evidence so clean that doubt becomes impossible and we can finally stop wrestling. It rarely comes. What comes instead is usually what this cloth gives us. Something real enough to keep you looking and ambiguous enough that you still have to choose. Perhaps that is the actual message of the Shroud of Turin. Not a photograph of a dead man, but a mirror held up to how faith works, where the evidence is genuinely there, genuinely strange, genuinely unexplained after 50 years of the best instruments humanity can build, and still stops one step short of forcing your hand. If today you find yourself waiting for certainty before you are willing to trust, waiting for the sign, the answer, the proof that finally removes the risk, remember that the man on this cloth never offered anyone that. He offered himself, and he let people decide. The evidence was always sufficient for those who wanted to look, and never sufficient to compel those who did not. If videos like this one help you see the meeting point between faith and evidence more clearly, please hit like, subscribe to the channel, and share it with someone who is wrestling with these questions right now. And leave a comment with your honest answer. Do you believe the Shroud of Turin is the burial cloth of Jesus of Nazareth? Or the most remarkable work of art that no one has ever been able to reproduce? Your reasoning might be exactly what opens up the conversation for everyone else. Thank you, and I will see you in the next video.